The heavy rain was falling hard against the windshield of the broken-down car. The wipers had given out miles ago, and the glass was a blurry mosaic of despair. The storm howled, shaking the rusted metal frame, a relentless force of nature that cared nothing for the stranded traveler shivering inside. The cold seeped through the floorboards, chilling the bone. It was the kind of night where hope felt like a luxury no one could afford. But then, cutting through the torrential downpour, the warm, steady beams of a heavy-duty pickup truck pierced the darkness. A man stepped out into the freezing rain, his boots sinking into the thick Texas mud, a wide-brimmed Stetson shielding his weathered face. He did not ask for a name, he did not ask for money. He simply offered a strong, calloused hand, a quiet word of comfort, and the undeniable assurance that everything was going to be all right. George Strait had pulled over on that desolate stretch of highway because that was what a decent man did. He carried the weight of others because he knew, deep in his soul, how heavy the world could be. Now, years later, a different kind of storm was raging. The rain was falling just as hard against the tinted glass of a luxury corporate vehicle idling in the concrete bowels of the Bridgestone Arena in Nashville, Tennessee. But the cold, George felt tonight, was not from the weather outside. It was a deep, gnawing chill that radiated from his very bones, a profound ache that no amount of stage lights or roaring crowds could ever warm. He stepped out of the vehicle, the polished soles of his flawless Lucchese boots meeting the cold, damp concrete of the underground loading dock. The air down here was stale, tasting of exhaust fumes, stale coffee, and the metallic tang of corporate anxiety. The backstage area of the arena was a chaotic labyrinth. It was a far cry from the open plains of Texas, far from the smell of sweet grass and the honest sweat of a day spent working the land. Here, the environment was claustrophobic, bathed in harsh, unforgiving neon light that cast long, unnatural shadows. Thick black cables snaked across the floor like vipers, and the narrow corridors were jammed with stressed production assistants, frantic stage managers and executives in slim fit suits, clutching digital clipboards as if their lives depended on the glowing numbers on the screens. The air was thick with the sickeningly sweet smell of industrial hairspray, cheap cologne, and the palpable, desperate hunger for ratings. George walked through the madness like a ghost moving through a graveyard. He was a monument of stone in a sea of frantic plastic. He kept his head down, the brim of his hat hiding his eyes, offering a polite nod to the working crew, the men and women hauling heavy equipment who recognized the quiet dignity of a man who knew the value of hard labor. But inside, George was fighting a battle that no one could see. Tonight was not just another television special. Tonight was not just a nationally broadcast tribute to his legendary career. Tonight was an anniversary. It was the exact date, burned into his memory like a brand on cattle, of the most profound and devastating loss a father could ever endure. The memory of the daughter they had lost years ago was a silent phantom walking beside him, her absence a roaring silence that deafened the noise of the arena. He reached his temporary dressing room, a sterile, windowless box that someone had attempted to make hospitable, with a cheap leather sofa and a tray of untouched hors d'oeuvres. George closed the door, shutting out the relentless buzzing of the radios and the shouting of the directors. The silence in the room was heavy, thick with unspoken sorrow. He stood in the center of the room, a tall, unyielding figure, and slowly began to polish the large silver buckle of his belt with a soft cloth. It was a grounding mechanism, a tactile anchor in a world that felt like it was spinning wildly out of control. The rhythmic motion of his hands, the cool metal beneath his fingers, it reminded him of the ranch, of mending fences, of tasks that made sense in a world that often did not. His jaw was set hard, muscles ticking beneath his weathered skin. His eyes, usually warm and inviting, were squeezed shut, fighting back a tide of grief that threatened to drown him. He was a man of deep Christian faith, a man who believed in the Lord's plan, but on nights like this the cross he carried felt impossibly heavy. He was the king of country, the stoic cowboy who never showed weakness, the man millions looked up to for strength. But beneath the Stetson and the starched shirt, he was just a father missing his little girl, bleeding internally while the world demanded a performance. Sitting quietly in the corner of the room, watching him with eyes that saw straight through the armor, was Norma. She was his anchor, the quiet force of nature that had stood by his side through the highest peaks and the darkest valleys. She did not wear flashy sequins or heavy makeup. She possessed a serene, understated elegance, a strength born of the Texas soil. She knew the agony tearing at his soul tonight. She knew that every breath he took in this suffocating building was a monumental effort. She did not offer empty platitudes. She simply held the space for him, her presence a silent vow that he did not have to carry the burden alone. The fragile sanctuary of the dressing room was violently shattered. The door did not just open, it was shoved inward with an aggressive, entitled force. A group of executives stormed into the room, bringing the chaotic noise of the hallway with them. Leading the pack was Bradley, a high-powered producer from Los Angeles. Bradley was the epitome of the modern music industry machine, a man who saw artists not as human beings, but as walking algorithms, content generators meant to be squeezed for every drop of marketable emotion. He wore a sharp, expensive suit, his eyes darting frantically, completely oblivious to the sacred, grieving silence he had just desecrated. Bradley did not knock. He did not ask for permission. He did not say good evening. He marched right up to George, invading his personal space, waving a glowing tablet in the air. The producer smelled of expensive espresso and ruthless ambition, a stark contrast to the scent of leather and quiet dignity that surrounded George. "Listen up, George," Bradley barked, his voice loud and grating, lacking any shred of the respect due to a man of Strait's stature. "We have a massive change in the rundown. The network numbers are dipping in the second hour, so we are injecting a viral moment right before you hit the stage." George stopped polishing his belt buckle. He slowly raised his head, his eyes calm but carrying the dangerous stillness of a storm on the horizon. He looked at Bradley, waiting patiently, his manners too ingrained to interrupt, even when faced with blatant disrespect. "We are bringing Dolly Parton back here in 10 minutes, Bradley continued, pacing the small room, his assistants furiously typing on their devices. "We are going to set up a 3-camera cross-shoot right out in the hallway. I need you to walk out there, look completely surprised, and I want an emotional embrace. I am talking tears, George. I want you to break down. We need to sell the narrative that you are overwhelmed by her presence and the magnitude of this tribute. It is going to be gold for the social media teams. Gold." The room went dead silent, the kind of silence that precedes a lightning strike. Norma shifted slightly on the sofa, her posture straightening, her eyes locking onto Bradley with a quiet, terrifying intensity. But she did not speak. She let her husband handle his business. George carefully folded the polishing cloth and placed it on the table. He stood to his full height, towering over the frantic producer. When he spoke, his voice was low, smooth and steady, carrying the gravel of 1,000 dusty roads. "I appreciate your hard work, sir," George said, his tone perfectly polite but entirely unyielding. "But I will be glad to greet Miss Parton warmly, as I always do. She is a dear friend. However, I do not do theatre, sir. I do not fake my emotions for a camera, and I will not manufacture tears to sell a television show." Bradley stopped pacing. He stared at George, his face twisting into a mask of incredulous anger. To Bradley, standing in this room, he was the master of the universe, and George was just an aging asset being uncooperative. He did not understand the code of the country. He did not understand that a man's word and his authenticity were all he truly owned in this world. "You do not seem to understand the situation, George," Bradley sneered, taking a step closer, attempting to use intimidation. "This is not a request. This is the network mandate. We are paying for a spectacle, and you are going to give us one. You think people tune in to see a statue? They want blood, they want tears, they want a breakdown. You are going to walk out into that hallway, and you are going to cry when Dolly hugs you, or I will personally see to it that this broadcast is edited in a way that makes you look like a tired, ungrateful relic." The injustice of the moment hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Here was a man, actively bleeding from a wound of grief so profound it defied language, being ordered by a soulless corporate entity to fake an emotion he was currently fighting with every ounce of his strength to suppress. They wanted to commodify his pain, to twist his stoicism into a circus act. George felt the heat rise in his chest, the righteous anger of a man whose boundaries and dignity were being trampled upon by men who would not last 10 minutes doing real work in the Texas sun. His hands trembled slightly, resting at his sides. It was not fear. It was the Herculean effort required to maintain his composure, to uphold his Christian values of patience and grace in the face of absolute cruelty. If you believe that the respect and dignity of a hard-working man are worth far more than any cheap television spectacle, subscribe to the channel to follow more stories where honor and true values prevail over modern superficiality. Bradley, mistaking George's silent restraint for submission, snapped his fingers at his assistants. "Move him out. Get him in the hallway. Set the lights. We are doing this now." Before George could protest, the machinery of the production crew surged forward. They did not physically touch him, but they crowded him, using a wall of cameras and bodies to herd the legendary singer out of the quiet sanctuary of his dressing room and into the blindingly bright, chaotic corridor. It was a humiliating maneuver, treating a man of immense respect like livestock being corralled into a chute. George found himself standing in the middle of the hallway, bathed in the harsh glare of portable spotlights. The air conditioning blasted down on him, freezing the sweat on his neck. Microphones hovered just out of frame, waiting to catch every breath. He lowered his head, the brim of his Stetson casting a deep shadow over his face. He felt like a caged animal, trapped in a neon prison, surrounded by predators who wanted to feed on his soul. The anniversary of his daughter's passing was screaming in his mind, a deafening roar of sorrow, while the producers shouted countdowns and adjusted lenses around him. He gripped the edge of his belt, praying silently for strength, praying for the moment to pass, praying that his heart would not shatter completely under the blinding lights of a world that had forgotten what it meant to be human. The heavy air in the hallway felt like a physical weight pressing down on George Strait's shoulders. The portable spotlights that the production crew had hurriedly wheeled out were blinding, casting a harsh, artificial glare that washed out the natural color of the cinder block walls. It was a brutal, unforgiving illumination, designed to capture every bead of sweat, every micro-expression, every flicker of vulnerability for the millions of viewers sitting in their comfortable living rooms. The heat radiating from the massive bulbs was intense, baking the stale oxygen, making it difficult to draw a full breath. To George, standing there in his starched shirt and heavy denim, the heat felt like the oppressive, suffocating humidity of a Texas summer, right before a violent thunderstorm breaks. But there was no rain coming to wash this away. There was only the relentless, unblinking stare of 3 massive television cameras, their black lenses pointed at him like the barrels of loaded rifles. Bradley, the executive from Los Angeles, paced just behind the camera operators, a frantic silhouette in the blinding light. He was muttering rapidly into a headset, his hands waving in the air as he orchestrated the ambush. He was a man who lived his entire life in the shallow end of the human experience, a man who measured the worth of a soul by the engagement metrics on a screen. He looked at George not as a legendary artist, not as a father carrying an unbearable burden, but as a stubborn piece of machinery that needed to be struck in just the right place to produce the desired output. "Just give me the tears, George," Bradley hissed from the shadows, his voice a grating, metallic sound over the ambient noise of the arena. "When she comes around that corner, I want you to completely break. I want the audience to see the king of country crumble. It is the narrative we need, do not fight it. Just let the cameras do their job." George did not look at him. He kept his head bowed, the wide brim of his custom Stetson casting a protective shadow over his eyes. His jaw was locked so tight that the muscles ached. His large, calloused hands hung at his sides, the fingers curling slightly inward. He was using every ounce of discipline he had cultivated over a lifetime of hard work and deep faith to keep from walking over and dismantling the arrogant producer with his bare hands. But George was a man of peace, a man who believed that anger was a poison that destroyed the vessel that carried it. He closed his eyes beneath the shadow of his hat and retreated into his own mind, seeking refuge in the only place these corporate vultures could not reach. He thought of the ranch. He thought of the vast, unbroken horizon of South Texas, where the sky was so big it made a man realize how small his problems truly were. He imagined the smell of the damp earth after a spring rain, the sweet, grassy scent of the cattle pastures, the rhythmic, comforting sound of his horse's hooves hitting the dirt trail. He needed those memories now more than ever, because the reality of this day was threatening to tear him apart from the inside out. Today was the anniversary. It was the day the world had stopped turning. It was the day a late-night phone call had shattered his universe into a million jagged pieces, delivering the news that his beautiful, vibrant daughter had been taken from this earth in a tragic accident. The pain of that loss was not something that faded with time. It was a living, breathing thing, a heavy stone he carried in his chest every single day. Most days he could carry it with grace. Most days he could smile for the fans, sing the songs, and be the stoic pillar of strength everyone expected him to be. But today the stone was impossibly heavy. The grief was a rising tide, choking him, burning his throat. And now, this soulless machine of an industry was demanding that he take his sacred private agony and perform it like a trained animal for a television special. It was a violation of his dignity so profound that it made his blood run cold. Down the long concrete corridor, a new sound began to cut through the low hum of the arena. It was the sharp, rhythmic clicking of high heels, accompanied by a rising chorus of excited voices and the rustle of expensive fabrics. The air suddenly shifted, the stale smell of the loading dock giving way to the rich floral scent of a signature perfume. The atmosphere crackled with a sudden electric energy. Dolly Parton was approaching. She moved like a glittering force of nature, surrounded by a tight phalanx of makeup artists, wardrobe assistants, and personal security. Even in the dim light of the backstage tunnels, she seemed to glow, her iconic blonde hair towering, her outfit a dazzling explosion of rhinestones and fringe that caught every stray beam of light. She was laughing, a bright, musical sound that usually brought joy to anyone who heard it. She was the undisputed queen of country, a master of the stage, a woman who had built an empire on a foundation of immense talent and an armor of sparkling, untouchable glamour. Bradley practically vibrated with excitement. He stepped out from behind the cameras, his face twisted into a grotesque mask of anticipation. "Here she comes," he whispered aggressively to the cameramen. "Tighten the focus. Get ready to push in on George's face. The second they embrace, I want extreme close-ups. Give me the emotion." Dolly turned the corner, stepping into the glaring light of the hallway. She saw the cameras first, her professional instincts kicking in instantly. Her smile widened, her posture straightened, ready to deliver the magic the network was paying for. Then she saw George. She saw him standing there, his head bowed, his posture rigid, looking like a man facing a firing squad rather than a friendly reunion. She opened her arms, preparing to call out his name, preparing to sweep him into the warm, highly publicized embrace Bradley had orchestrated. But before Dolly could take another step, before the cameras could capture the manufactured moment, the script was violently, beautifully torn apart. From the dark doorway of the dressing room, a figure emerged. It was not a security guard, it was not a publicist, it was Norma. Norma Strait moved with a quiet, devastating authority. She did not run, she did not shout, but the sheer force of her presence seemed to suck the oxygen out of the hallway. She wore a simple, elegant blouse and dark trousers, a stark contrast to the glittering spectacle of Dolly and the frantic, sweaty energy of the television crew. She was the bedrock upon which George had built his life, the silent guardian of his heart, and she had watched this circus abuse her husband for long enough. She walked directly into the blinding glare of the spotlights, stepping right between the massive camera lenses and the man she loved. She did not look at the lenses. She did not acknowledge the frantic producer. She simply raised one hand, her palm facing the camera operators. It was a universal, undeniable gesture to stop. The cameramen, seasoned professionals who had filmed riots and rock stars, instinctively lowered their rigs. There was something in Norma's eyes, a fierce, maternal fire, a protective fury so pure and absolute that it commanded instant obedience. Bradley panicked. "What are you doing?" he shouted, stepping forward, his face flushing red with anger. "You are ruining the shot. Get out of the frame. We are live to tape in 5 minutes." Norma slowly turned her head to look at Bradley. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Her voice was cold, sharp, and cut through the noise of the hallway like a steel blade. "You will turn those lights off," she said, her tone leaving absolutely no room for debate. "And you will step back. Now." Bradley opened his mouth to argue, to invoke the power of the network, to threaten them with breached contracts. But the words died in his throat. He looked at Norma, and for the first time in his career, he realized that there were forces in this world far more powerful than television ratings. He took a slow, hesitant step backward. Dolly, standing a few feet away, lowered her arms. The bright, camera-ready smile slowly faded from her face. She was a woman of immense emotional intelligence, a woman who had survived decades in a ruthless industry by learning to read the truth beneath the surface. She looked at Norma, standing like a shield before her husband. She looked at George, who had not moved, his large frame trembling slightly under the weight of his silent agony. Dolly instantly knew that something was terribly, terribly wrong. This was not stage fright. This was not fatigue. This was a deep, bleeding wound. Norma turned her back on the cameras and walked directly toward Dolly. Dolly's entourage parted instinctively, stepping aside as if making way for royalty. Norma reached out and took Dolly's hands in hers. The contrast was striking. Dolly's hands were manicured, adorned with heavy, sparkling rings. Norma's hands were plain, strong, the hands of a woman who had raised a family, who had prayed through the darkest nights, who knew the value of hard work and unwavering loyalty. Norma gently pulled Dolly out of the harsh glare of the spotlights, guiding her toward a shadowed alcove in the concrete wall, away from the microphones, away from the prying eyes of the crew. Dolly followed without a word of protest, her sparkling facade melting away, leaving only the compassionate, grounded woman who had been born in a one-room cabin in the Smoky Mountains. They stood close together in the shadows. The noise of the hallway seemed to fade into a dull roar, leaving them in a private, sacred space. Norma looked deeply into Dolly's eyes, and for the first time that evening, the stoic armor of the Texas rancher's wife cracked just a fraction. A sheen of tears appeared in Norma's eyes, reflecting the dim emergency lights of the corridor. "Dolly," Norma whispered, her voice trembling with a sorrow so profound it made the air heavy. Dolly squeezed her hands, leaning in closer, her own heart breaking at the sight of her friend's pain. "What is it, honey?" Dolly asked softly, her voice devoid of its usual musical lilt, replaced by a raw, genuine concern. "What are they doing to him?" Norma took a shaky breath, fighting to keep her composure. She glanced back at George, who was still standing under the dead lights, a solitary figure bearing the weight of the world. "Today is the day, Dolly," Norma whispered, the words catching in her throat. "Today is the anniversary. It is the day our little girl went to be with the Lord." Dolly gasped softly, her eyes widening in sudden, horrifying realization. The glitter, the lights, the cameras, the tribute show, it all suddenly felt profoundly obscene. She knew about the tragedy, of course. The entire country music family knew. But in the chaotic whirlwind of touring and television production, the specific date had slipped past the industry's radar. "He has been carrying it all day," Norma continued, her voice gaining strength, fueled by a righteous, protective anger. "He woke up crying before the sun came up. He came here to honor the music, to honor the fans because he gave his word. But that man out there," she gestured slightly toward Bradley without looking at him, "that producer, he knows. He found out what today is and he is trying to use it." Dolly's breath hitched. The blood drained from her face, replaced by a sudden, fierce heat. "He told George he had to cry on camera when he saw you," Norma said, the disgust evident in every syllable. "He told him he needed to break down to give them a viral moment. He is trying to force my husband to turn the worst day of our lives into a commercial for their network. George is dying inside, Dolly. He is trying so hard to be the man everyone expects him to be polite, to hold it together. But he is breaking, and I will not stand here and watch them strip him of his dignity." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the kind of silence that precedes a tectonic shift. Dolly Parton closed her eyes for a long moment. When she opened them, the sparkling, giggling superstar was entirely gone. In her place stood a matriarch of the mountains, a woman who understood that the bonds of family and the sanctity of grief were holy things, not to be trampled by the muddy boots of corporate greed. A cold, terrifying fury settled over Dolly's features. It was a righteous anger, the kind that burns slow and hot. She looked at Norma, her eyes blazing with a fierce sisterly solidarity. She squeezed Norma's hand so hard it almost hurt. "They messed with the wrong family today," Dolly whispered, her voice a low, dangerous growl that had never been captured on any record. "You stay right here, Norma. You let me handle this trash." Dolly let go of Norma's hands. She turned slowly, deliberately, stepping out of the shadows and back into the hallway. The air around her seemed to change, the glamorous aura replaced by an intimidating, undeniable power. She did not look at the cameras. She did not look at her entourage. Her eyes were locked onto Bradley, who was still standing near the monitors, nervously tapping his foot, completely unaware of the storm that was about to hit him. The clicking of Dolly's heels on the concrete floor sounded different now. It was not the sound of an entertainer making an entrance. It was the sound of a judge walking into a courtroom to deliver a sentence. She walked past George, gently brushing her hand against his rigid shoulder, in a silent promise of protection, and marched directly toward the cluster of executives. The entire hallway held its breath. The king of country was hurting, and the queen was about to go to war. The air in the corridor grew incredibly dense, heavy with an unspoken reckoning. Dolly Parton did not rush. Every step she took toward the cluster of television executives was measured, deliberate, and echoed against the cold, cinder-block walls like the steady strike of a blacksmith's hammer. The glittering rhinestones on her jacket, which only moments ago had reflected the joyful, sparkling persona of a global superstar, now seemed to catch the harsh light like the scales of a protective dragon. She was a daughter of the Appalachian Mountains, raised in a world where survival depended on the fierce loyalty of neighbors and the sacred bonds of family. She knew the agonizing, bone-deep pain of losing loved ones, and she knew the unforgivable sin of exploiting that pain for a cheap thrill. Bradley, the high-powered producer from Los Angeles, stood frozen. He clutched his digital tablet against his chest as if it were a shield, his eyes darting nervously between the approaching country music legend and his crew. He had built his entire career on manipulating emotions, on pushing artists to their breaking points to capture raw, marketable drama. He was used to dealing with fragile egos and desperate climbers who would sell their souls for a viral moment. But as Dolly stopped less than 2 feet away from him, Bradley realized with a sudden, sickening drop in his stomach that he had fundamentally miscalculated the caliber of the people he was dealing with tonight. "Turn those cameras off," Dolly commanded. She did not yell. She did not raise her pitch. Her voice was terrifyingly low, carrying a raspy, unyielding authority that cut through the ambient hum of the arena machinery like a razor through silk. It was a voice that commanded arenas, a voice that had negotiated with the most ruthless men in the music business and won every single time. Bradley swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing above his tight collar. "Dolly, listen," he stammered, attempting to paste a placating, professional smile onto his sweating face. "This is just television. We are trying to build a narrative arc for the broadcast. The network needs an emotional peak before he goes on stage, and your reunion is the perfect trigger. It is good for his brand, it is good for the ratings. We are just doing our jobs here." Dolly stared at him, her eyes narrowing into cold, sharp slits. The absolute lack of humanity in his words hung in the air, a foul stench that made her stomach turn. "Your job," Dolly said, her voice dripping with a lethal, quiet venom, "is to document a tribute to a man who has given his entire life to his craft and his fans. Your job is not to play God with a man's soul." She took one half-step closer, invading his space, forcing Bradley to lean back slightly to avoid her piercing gaze. "You listen to me, and you listen to me very carefully, son," Dolly continued, every word landing like a physical blow. "This is not your freak show. This is not a circus for you to direct. That man standing over there is a father. He is a husband. He is a man who wakes up every single day carrying a cross so heavy it would crush a weak boy like you into dust. You do not know the dirt under his fingernails. You do not know the miles he has driven, the prayers he has whispered in the dark, or the tears he has swallowed just to keep standing upright." Bradley opened his mouth to defend himself, to cite his contractual authority, but Dolly raised a single manicured finger, silencing him instantly. "Today is a holy day for that family," Dolly said, her voice vibrating with a fierce, protective sorrow. It is a day of mourning. And you, with your clipboards and your spreadsheets, thought you could drag him out here under these blinding lights, blindside him with my face, and force him to bleed out for your television cameras. You thought you could package a father's ultimate tragedy and sell it during a commercial break. The silence in the hallway was absolute. The camera operators, seasoned men and women who had spent their lives behind lenses, slowly began to lower their equipment. They looked at the floor, suddenly acutely aware of the gross violation they had been ordered to participate in. The heavy, oppressive heat of the portable spotlights suddenly felt less like illumination and more like an interrogation. "I'm going to say this exactly once," Dolly whispered, leaning in so close that only Bradley and the cameramen could hear the absolute finality in her tone. "You are going to evacuate this hallway immediately. You are going to take your lights, your microphones, and your soulless ambitions, and you are going to disappear. If I see a single red recording light blinking in this corridor, if I hear a single whisper of this moment making it into your broadcast, I will personally ensure that every artist in this town knows exactly what kind of vulture you are. You will never work in Nashville again." Bradley looked at her, his face completely drained of color. He looked past her to the camera crew, silently begging for backup, but his crew had already abandoned him. They were quietly powering down their rigs, coiling cables, and actively looking away from his panicked gaze. They respected the king and queen of country far more than they respected a temporary paycheck from a coastal executive. "Move," Dolly commanded, the word cracking like a whip. Bradley broke. The arrogant facade crumbled completely. He nodded frantically, a pathetic, jerky motion, and began waving his hands at the crew. "Pack it up," he hissed, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and profound humiliation. "We are moving to the secondary location. Let us go now." The retreat was swift and silent. The heavy wheels of the camera dollies rolled away over the concrete. The blinding spotlights were extinguished one by one, and the frantic, suffocating energy of the corporate machine evaporated. The hallway was plunged back into the dim, warm glow of the emergency lights. The oppressive heat began to dissipate, replaced by the cool, steady draft of the underground tunnels. Dolly stood her ground until the very last assistant had vanished around the corner. Only then did she let her shoulders drop a fraction of an inch. The fierce, intimidating matriarch softened, the righteous anger melting away to reveal the deep, aching empathy of a true friend. She turned around slowly. George was still standing exactly where they had left him. He had not moved a single muscle. His head was still bowed, his face hidden beneath the wide brim of his Stetson. His hands were clenched into tight fists at his sides, his knuckles white with the strain of holding himself together. The sudden absence of the cameras and the blinding lights had not erased his pain. It had simply removed the armor he had been forced to wear. Norma was standing just a few feet away from him, her hands clasped tightly together, her eyes shining with unshed tears. She had watched the entire confrontation with a quiet, fierce pride, but her focus remained entirely on her husband. She knew that the danger of the executives was gone, but the danger of his own breaking heart was still very real. Dolly walked toward him. Her footsteps were soft now, respectful, the sound of a woman approaching a sacred altar. She did not offer the bright, performative smile that the world expected from her. She did not offer a loud, boisterous greeting. She offered the only thing that mattered in a moment of absolute despair. She offered her humanity. She stepped directly in front of George. He was a mountain of a man, tall and broad-shouldered, a symbol of stoic Texas masculinity. But in this moment, under the dim lights of the concrete hallway, he looked fragile, like an ancient oak tree that had finally been struck by lightning. Dolly reached out and gently placed her hands on his chest. The smell of her floral perfume mixed with the scent of his starched cotton shirt and the faint, lingering aroma of leather and horsetack. She did not say a word. She simply slid her arms around his waist and rested her cheek against his chest, right over his heart. It was not a Hollywood hug. It was a deep, grounding embrace, the kind of embrace a mother gives a wounded child, the kind of embrace that says, without a single syllable, that you are safe now and you do not have to be strong anymore. Norma stepped forward, moving to George's side. She wrapped her arms around his broad shoulders from the side, pressing her face against his arm. She was his anchor, his North Star, the woman who had shared every tear and every triumph. Together, the two women formed a fortress of pure, unadulterated love around the grieving father. For a long, agonizing moment, George remained rigid. His body was locked in a state of sheer survival, his mind still fighting the instinct to suppress the agony, to maintain the stoic cowboy facade that he had worn for decades. But the warmth of Norma's touch, the fierce protective loyalty of Dolly's embrace, and the profound silent understanding between them slowly began to melt the ice in his veins. Dolly closed her eyes and began to hum. It was not a chart-topping hit. It was an old simple gospel hymn, a melody born in the wooden pews of a country church, a song about finding peace on the other side of the river, about laying down heavy burdens at the feet of the Lord. Her voice was barely a whisper, a soft, vibrating resonance that traveled directly into George's chest. The vibration of the hymn, the absolute safety of the moment, it was the final strike against the dam. George Strait took a deep, shuddering breath. The sound was ragged, tearing out of his throat like a physical wound. His broad shoulders hitched, his jaw, locked for so long, finally trembled. And then, surrounded by the quiet, unyielding love of his wife and the profound empathy of his friend, the king of country broke. He did not wail. He did not scream. The grief of a quiet man is a silent, devastating storm. The tears came fast and heavy, slipping from beneath his closed eyelids, rolling down his weathered cheeks, and falling onto the cold concrete floor. He wrapped his massive arms around Dolly and Norma, pulling them close, burying his face in the space between them. His massive frame shook with the force of his weeping. It was a raw, visceral release, a purging of the toxic, suffocating pressure he had been carrying all day. He cried for the daughter he would never walk down the aisle. He cried for the birthdays missed, the laughter silenced, the empty chair at the dinner table. He cried because the world demanded that he be a legend. But in his heart, he was just a man who missed his little girl. Norma stroked his hair, her own tears flowing freely now, silently murmuring words of comfort, prayers of strength, reminding him that he was loved, that he was understood, that his pain was valid and holy. Dolly held him tighter, her humming continuing, a steady, rhythmic lifeline pulling him back from the edge of the abyss. They stood there in the dimly lit corridor for a long time, three figures huddled together against the cold machinery of the industry, proving that the strongest thing a human being can do is to share their brokenness with those they trust. Slowly, the storm began to pass. The ragged, gasping breaths turned into deep, exhausted sighs. The trembling in George's shoulders began to subside. He had faced the darkest corner of his soul, and he had not been destroyed because he had not faced it alone. George gently pulled back. He kept one arm wrapped securely around Norma's waist, pulling her flush against his side. With his free hand, he reached into the back pocket of his denim jeans and pulled out a simple, rustic cotton handkerchief. It was not silk, it was not designer. It was the handkerchief of a working man. He slowly wiped the tears from his face, dragging the rough cotton over his eyes, clearing the physical evidence of his breakdown. He took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the cool air of the hallway. The crushing, suffocating weight that had been pressing on his chest all day was gone. The grief was still there. It would always be there. But the poison of having to perform it, of having to hide it from the corporate vultures, had been washed away by the tears. He felt lighter. He felt clean. He carefully folded the handkerchief and put it back in his pocket. He reached up and adjusted the brim of his Stetson, pulling it down slightly over his brow, the familiar gesture grounding him, bringing him back to the present moment. He looked down at Dolly Parton. His eyes were red-rimmed, but the dangerous, stormy stillness was gone. They were warm again, filled with an immense, quiet gratitude. "Thank you, Dolly," George said, his voice thick with emotion, the gravelly baritone softer than usual. "Thank you for that." Dolly reached up and gently patted his cheek, offering him a small, genuine smile that held more beauty than 1,000 magazine covers. "You do not ever have to thank me for being your friend, George," she whispered. "We look out for our own. That is the country way. You just go out there tonight and you sing for her. You sing so loud the angels have to stop and listen." George nodded slowly. He turned his head and looked at Norma. They did not need words. The look that passed between them was a testament to decades of shared life, a silent vow that they had survived the worst and they would continue to survive, together. He kissed her forehead gently, a gesture of profound respect and endless love. A stage manager, a young man who had wisely stayed far away from the confrontation, peeked his head around the corner. "Mr. Strait," he called out softly, his voice incredibly respectful, almost hesitant. "We are 2 minutes to curtain, sir. Whenever you are ready." George Strait stood to his full height. He rolled his shoulders back, settling into his frame. He was no longer a caged animal. He was no longer a product to be manipulated. He was a man made whole by the decency of the people who loved him. He offered his arm to Norma, and together, with Dolly walking proudly by their side, they made their way down the corridor toward the deafening roar of the arena. The transition from the quiet, shadowed hallway to the massive, blindingly bright stage was instantaneous. As George stepped out from behind the heavy black curtains, the Bridgestone arena erupted. Thousands of fans rose to their feet, a sea of cowboy hats, boots, and glowing cell phone screens, screaming their adoration for the man who had soundtracked their lives. The noise was a physical force, a tidal wave of love and respect. George walked to the center of the stage, the spotlight hitting him perfectly, illuminating the silver buckle of his belt and the pristine shape of his hat. He picked up his acoustic guitar, the polished wood feeling familiar and right in his hands. He stepped up to the microphone. He did not offer a flashy, scripted greeting. He simply looked out at the massive crowd, took a breath, and strummed the first chord. High above the stage in the darkened, soundproof control room, Bradley and the network executives stood completely silent. They watched the massive monitors as George Strait began to sing. The performance was not the manufactured, crying breakdown Bradley had tried to force. It was something infinitely more powerful. George sang with a raw, bleeding emotion that transcended the plastic confines of the television industry. Every note carried the weight of his lived experience, the depth of his sorrow and the triumph of his enduring faith. It was a visceral, devastatingly beautiful performance that cut straight to the bone. The executives watched, paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the authenticity radiating from the screens. For the first time in their cynical, metric-driven careers, they felt a genuine knot form in their throats. They realized, with a profound and shameful clarity, that they could never manufacture true greatness. They could never write a script that matched the power of a man standing in his truth, carrying his burdens honorably, supported by the unwavering love of his family. They realized that the true strength of a cowboy is not in pretending the pain does not exist, but in having the courage to face the storm, knowing that the people who truly matter will never let him face it alone.